It's the dark side of David Whitmer.
Yeah.
He has
Oh,
a
yeah.
very dark side.
But it's this other side that I think most people don't recognize.
Original apostates, a lot of them retained their belief in the Book of Mormon, but hated the church. Yeah, you can believe in the Book of Mormon and be an apostate. During the very, very horrible Missouri persecutions, David Whitmer is actually driving the coaches for the military guys while they raid the houses of the saints. Welcome to Latter-day Saint Ideas. I'm Andrew Knaupp, and I'm here with my good friend David Janeway, and we are here to talk about a different David, David Whitmer, and why we need to stop believing David Whitmer and having him as a witness that we quote in the church. Talking about this for a while now, about the question of what happens if witnesses are not credible. And if the law of witnesses is built, does the law of witnesses need every single witness to be credible? Or is the purpose of the law of witnesses to have multiple witnesses in case any one witness loses their credibility? And this is not something we've heard discussed anywhere else, and so we're discussing it here. And the idea is, what would happen if one of the three witnesses had denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon? What would that mean? And then the further question that comes from that is, well, if one of the three witnesses or several of the three witnesses decided they wanted to deny their testimony of Joseph Smith as a prophet, what would that mean? And so let's talk about that first question, Dave. Why do you think it's okay if we don't have every witness be credible?
No, it's interesting. We have the original 12 apostles with Jesus, right? And we know one betrayed Jesus. We don't have a lot of words by Judas Iscariot. I think his words have been pretty much omitted. He had the 12. One went astray, one betrayed Jesus. We still have the other 11. And I believe that of these 11 witnesses, including Joseph, you got a quorum, you got 12 that were witnesses to the plates. I believe that if one of them had denied it, the church should be doing just fine as it is right now. Our narrative, however, might be a little bit different. In fact, I believe it would be very different than it is now. And we would be hearing apologists and others talking about how it's important that we have the other witnesses as strong versus the one that's not. In a court of law, the reason you have as many witnesses as you can is because you want to have a strong case. But if you have a few weak ones in there, you can say, you know what, I'm going to put them aside and we're going to focus on the ones that are strongest. And many cases do just fine.
I love that, because we don't say, well, because one of Jesus's disciples denied him, that's proof that the entire resurrection and all of Jesus's teachings,
That's right.
It was all bunk, it was all untrue, because one of them came out and said, I deny this, right? And if we had a record of any of the witnesses denying their testimony, it really wouldn't make a difference. And so now the next question we ask is, I've heard many YouTubers say that we have to believe the writings and words of David Whitmer through his whole life, or somehow it undermines the credibility of the Book of Mormon. And I think our analogy right there works. No, David Whitmer's words throughout his life do not undermine the credibility of the Book of Mormon if we say David Whitmer fell away. He was an apostate. Let's talk about specifically what it was that David Whitmer did that made him an apostate. Started off during the Kirtland apostasy period. And during that time, many members fell away from the church. Up to a third of the church, I believe, is reported to have apostatized. And during that time, at some point, they're even considering using him to replace Joseph as head of the church. After David Whitmer leaves the church in 1838 is when he gets excommunicated. He is bitter, and he writes about Joseph Smith, and later writes a book that we read, so you don't have to read it, called An Address to All Believers in Christ. And this book basically is David Whitmer claiming that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet from basically 1829 on. He sometimes says 1829, sometimes he says from the day the church was organized, April 6, 1830, Joseph was a fallen prophet. And he gives all these reasons in this 70-page book that he wrote as to why Joseph Smith was fallen, why the members of the church who follow Brigham Young, and he even goes after the RLDS church, are all mistaken. This is the crux of part of our reason for making this video is the main quotes that are used about Joseph Smith using a seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon and seeing words in English appear and disappear on parchment that he's supposedly seeing a vision of, all come from David Whitmer, written in this book 40 years after the events of the Restoration were unfolding, and claiming that he is the expert on how the translation of the Book of Mormon happened. And at the same time, in this same book, completely discrediting Joseph Smith, the Doctrine and Covenants, and a whole list of things we're going to talk about here in this video. So Dave, what did I leave out?
Well, just the one thing I wanted to add, what's fascinating about David Whitmer's, his book and this pamphlet, he calls it a pamphlet, is he still maintains a testimony or a belief in the Book of Mormon. In fact, it's imperative for what he's trying to do that the Book of Mormon must be true, because it's part of his new church, which he's trying to pull members of our faith and the RLDS faith out of. And one thing that apologists will say is, well, because he never denied the Book of Mormon, that somehow makes him credible. But it really is the equivalent of Warren Jeffs believing in the Book of Mormon still, and us saying, well, at least Warren Jeffs still believes in the Book of Mormon, even though he's doing all these nasty things. We would not say anything is credible from him. We don't even. We disavow him 100% completely. I believe that David Whitmer, when some of the things that he did that we'll talk about today is up there in pretty nastiness, I would say. I don't know if that's the right, nicest way to say it. It's
the dark side of David Whitmer. Yeah. He has a very dark side.
Yeah. But it's this other side that I think most people don't recognize, that they say, well, he still believes in the Book of Mormon, and say, hey, there's a lot of people out there that still believe in the Bible, that are of many different faiths, that people of different faiths would disavow, even though they retain their belief in the Bible, which is ironic because we're one of them. We believe in the Bible, yet other Christian faiths don't want to acknowledge us.
It's a great point. That's a great point. I think one of the things we think about is, you think apostates, they must hate the Book of Mormon and the church, which is sort of modern day apostates. But the older original apostates, a lot of them retained their belief in the Book of Mormon, but hated the church. Clearly, your point is one that is not made very often, which is, yeah, you can believe in the Book of Mormon and be an apostate. Most of the polygamists that are apostates also believe in the Book of Mormon as well.
Right.
So I had plenty of experience of that with my grandmother, who was an apostate polygamist for 40 years. And she talked about the Book of Mormon, she talked about the Doctrine and Covenants, but denied other parts of the church and who was the rightful successors to Joseph Smith and all of that. Are we okay? Are we okay? Can we accept this as a church? Can we stop citing David Whitmer? I think we should.
Absolutely.
I think we should. And I think part of the reason we should do that is because the old expression, if you pick up a stick, you've picked up both ends of the stick. And you can't pick up David Whitmer's testimony of the Book of Mormon and his witness that it happened and separate that from his testimony of how Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet, how the church was fallen, how it had fallen into error, and how it was following the doctrine of devils. You're picking up both of those things when you pick up David Whitmer's testimony and you start quoting it. And we've even had that happen with people like Trent Horn and others who use that against Jacob Hansen and other people who try to quote David Whitmer as the strong witness of the Book of Mormon.
That's right.
They pick him up, and they also pick up all of this garbage that he said about Joseph Smith. And it makes our case, our case look very weak, because how can you honestly, it's like the classic courtroom drama where they discredit the witness and they tell the jury, how can you believe this witness when you know that they did these things? How can we believe David Whitmer's testimony of the Book of Mormon when he attacks Joseph Smith as a fallen prophet and talks about how the whole church is fallen and all these things? We shouldn't. We should just let it go. It's time to just let David Whitmer go. And I think what's funny is I don't think Brigham Young and the other early members of the church had any problems letting David Whitmer go. He was not being cited by them in General Conference. He was not being quoted by them and held up as this great witness to the Restoration. They just let him go. They were like, yep, he's printed in the Book of Mormon. We don't need to quote him.
That's right. How often do we quote from excommunicated apostles or others in General Conference today? We don't.
Exactly.
Not at all.
So in terms of just actionable items, before we get into David Whitmer's teachings, one of the things that Hannah Stoddard points out in her book, which is a great book, you guys should all buy it and read it, Cedar Stone versus Urim and Thummim. She points out that during the very, very horrible Missouri persecutions, where far west, where it's besieged, members of church have their arms taken away, Joseph's hauled to eventually Liberty Jail, David Whitmer is actually driving the coaches, one of the coaches, for the military guys while they raid the houses of the saints. Here's the quote from the book. In the campaign, when the militia was ordered to drive the Mormons from the state at the point of the bayonet, David Whitmer drove one of the military baggage wagons to Far West. So here you have someone who was a leader in the church helping the mob to rob and pillage the saints. How do you think the saints felt about David Whitmer after that? It's one thing to have your words betray the church you were a part of. It's entirely different to see you driving the wagons for the mob.
Yeah, it's next level. It's a next level of betrayal. And as we talk about this book, David Whitmer does the typical, I don't really want to do this, but I feel I need to. And I love Joseph as a friend. I mean, can I go ahead and start there?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's start rattling off all the false claims that David Whitmer makes in the address to all believers in Christ.
Perfect. So it's interesting that the book itself is, again, it's designed to pull people away. I mean, the title is called An Address to All Believers in Christ by a Witness to the Divine Authenticity of the Book of Mormon. I believe David Whitmer is using the Book of Mormon and him being a witness as basically a tool to say he has authority to pull people away.
He's using it as credibility, right? He's saying,
Exactly.
I'm credible, and all the things I'm about to say should be taken seriously because I was a witness to the Book of Mormon.
Exactly.
Which goes back to your point. Goes back to your point, Dave, about why is he incentivized to keep bearing testimony of the Book of Mormon? Not just because he's using the Book of Mormon in his church, but because his claim to authority is because he's a witness to the Book of Mormon.
That's right. And it's the same thing with the use of seer stones. So the quote that we use about Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon about the seer stone, I believe he's also using that as a tool to show that he also has authority and I can do just what Joseph did. Because David Whitmer and others in his family had seer stone. So here's a quote. Here's a quote for the first one I want to throw out of the gate about Joseph being fallen. So this is what he says. I do not mean to persecute Joseph, the translator of the Book of Mormon. I love him, and I love Joseph, his son, and believe him to be a good man. Joseph, like many of those of old whom God had chosen, fell into error. And why should we want to follow any man into error? Should we put our trust in the arm of flesh? Nay, verily. So he's saying, oh, I love Joseph. I really don't want to do this, but I need to do this. So here's one that I thought was pretty slamming. And of course, David Whitmer was very much against and very much opposed to polygamy. And some of those that are anti-Joseph Smith was a polygamist thing. David Whitmer clearly believed that Joseph Smith was practicing polygamy. And this is what he said. This I think is pretty damning. He says, quote, in the revelation on polygamy, it says that Emma Smith, Brother Joseph's wife, must receive the revelation to allow Brother Joseph to have more wives, or she shall be destroyed. But in less than a year after giving this revelation, Brother Joseph himself was destroyed, and Emma lived for many years after. I think this is a hardcore slap to Joseph's face.
It's more than just a slap to his face. Throughout this book, he basically says that Joseph Smith's been deceived by the devil and that he was using his own brain and his own mind to make revelations up, because any revelation after the conclusion of the Book of Mormon that wasn't, he believed, using a single seer stone, which I reject, that Joseph Smith was using his single seer stone to receive revelations. He was using the Urim and Thummim, which were two stones set in a bow, to receive revelation at that point, and some revelations without the two stones. But his argument is that everything after that has to be rejected. And so it's not just about the specific polygamy issues. It's everything that happened in the church.
Yeah. The calling of high priests, he's against. The church being organized, having one person as a president, he says he's against. The thing that's interesting about David Whitmer is you mentioned he was excommunicated in 1838?
Yeah.
Yet his book is claiming the church was in full apostasy by April 6, 1830. Yet he remained a member, and he was over a stake, I believe, in Missouri, while after 1830. So David's kind of throwing some dates here around that are not consistent. I just have two more quotes, if I may. He says, this is a short one, but Joseph went on in the persuasions of men, and then, quote, just before April 6, 1830, some of the brethren began to think that the church should have a leader, just like the children of Israel wanting a king. Again, That's the give us a king like other nations. Clearly, he's saying that is wrong. And this is having a president of the church, one person. But then he says this: now I do not judge nor say whether Saul, David, Solomon, or Joseph will be saved or lost. These are all in the hands of a just God. Perhaps the errors of David were more grievous than those of Joseph. Perhaps. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
What did David do versus what he claims Joseph did?
I mean,
it's pretty harsh.
The people who want, and this is the problem, part of the problem we've seen is people want to say, well, he said some things, he had a falling out. It sounds like there was like a personal argument over something, and that David Whitmer kind of had a personal issue with Joseph Smith, but never really denied. No, he says that the office of high priest should have never been restored. He specifically says the name of the church is wrong, that it should not be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It should just be called the Church of Christ, because that's how it was initially in some of the early revelations. It was referred to that way. So that's another one. He also says that we should have never had two priesthoods. He says there's no Melchizedek and Aaronic priesthoods, and he says that neither one of those is mentioned in the Book of Mormon. It just says authority from God. He also says the entire Doctrine and Covenants should be disbelieved, that it is like creed so much as any sectarian creed. He says that any revelations that were received after 1829 were the product of Joseph Smith's personal mind and Sidney Rigdon telling Joseph what to write, because he claims that Sidney Rigdon was just influencing Joseph with whatever whims he wanted, and that when Sidney Rigdon told Joseph to do something, Joseph would all of a sudden have a revelation and that thing would happen. He also says that when the printing press that was printing the Book of Commandments in Jackson County, Missouri, was destroyed, he says that that was basically God's judgment, that they should have never printed the revelations, and that God basically was bringing down his judgment against them, and even claims that he prophesied to Joseph that if they printed those revelations, the press would be destroyed and would not be printed. And so he claims that that's a fulfillment of a prophecy that he claims to have given. So here he is twisting these moments of persecution of the church to his own ends, to somehow claim that, showing that he has the gift of prophecy to predict that these things are happening, and that he tried to warn Joseph and the early leaders, and they wouldn't listen. So he's claiming spiritual gifts, basically. Another one, he says, is that instead of saying that the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates were prepared for the purpose of translating the book, he says, this is on page 42, the Book of Mormon was translated from golden plates by the gift and power of God, by means prepared of God, the stone of which I have spoken. And then he says, soon after Brother Joseph finished the translation, he gave up the stone and all his revelations after that. So not only is he denying that the Urim and Thummim were prepared, he's saying that this single seer stone that Joseph ends up just giving to Oliver Cowdery after the Book of Mormon's translated, supposedly that it was used for translation, that this divine instrument prepared from God was just given away, and it was so important, but yet it was just given away after it was prepared by God, and that Joseph couldn't have revelations after that, which is interesting, because then wouldn't the implication be that now Oliver Cowdery would be the one because he has the brown seer stone? It doesn't hold water.
Yeah, I have a quote here on that. He says the revelations in the Book of Commandments up to June 1829, this is a quote, were given through the stone through which the Book of Mormon was translated. So he's equating, you got to use the stone. That's how the Book of Mormon was translated. That's how you receive revelation. Quote, these are the only revelations that can be relied upon.
Here's how he says about Doctrine and Covenants, again, because he believes that anything not received through the single seer stone shouldn't be believed. He says, there are false doctrines of importance in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, and I desire to prove them false doctrines and get you to lay them aside and believe only what Christ taught and meant for us to believe. And here's what he lists off as false doctrines. He says, it's on page 42, if Christ did not mean for high priests to be ordained in his church, it is a most serious error to have ordained them. If Christ did not mean for the doctrine of baptism for the dead to be an ordinance in his church, it is a serious error. If you are in error concerning the gathering and building the city New Jerusalem, it is a serious error. If Christ did not mean for them to change the name which he gave to the church in 1829, it is a serious error, and likewise other errors taught in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. So he's just rattling off these doctrines that we hold to be true, and just saying, no, they're all wrong. And he kind of falls back on this idea that if the Book of Mormon doesn't mention it, then it's false. So, of course, we don't have mention of baptism for the dead in the Book of Mormon. And, and the church in the Book of Mormon is just called the Church of Christ, right? So he falls back on this again, that the Book of Mormon becomes the ultimate authority, a lot like evangelicals are with what they claim is the Bible, even though what books they include in that title is up for debate.
Right. And what's interesting is, as I was reading this, you and I have gone through it more than once, is I kept thinking of this Doctrines of Christ group that has been popping up over the last several years, because one of their claims is what? It's not in the Book of Mormon. It's not doctrine. And I kept going, man, David Whitmer should be your leader. Why isn't he your leader, guys?
Yeah. And one of the things I don't know, because I haven't researched to see if this is the case, but one of the main claims you hear today is when people say, oh, the Bible says that if an angel from heaven comes and tells you any other gospel than the one that I've declared, you should be accursed. David Whitmer says that about Joseph Smith. And I wonder if he's one of the first people to make this charge. Maybe he wasn't, but he's sure repeating it. He's sure repeating this idea that, oh, it's a false gospel because the things that Joseph Smith is teaching go against the true doctrines, which he claims are in the Book of Mormon. And he's parroting the same arguments, saying that any other gospel than the one we're claiming is the truth, you hear it. Anything other than our interpretation means you have a false gospel. And he gets kind of worked up as he goes along. He gets a little stronger than he starts out with. But here's some of these phrases he says. Why, oh why, will you continue to trust in the man, meaning Joseph Smith, who has erred and introduced doctrines of error into the Church of Christ? Why will you continue in blindness? That's on page 60. Then he claims that somehow poor Joseph repented right before his death, which I don't know if I think he might have heard something like that from Joseph Smith Jr., Joseph Smith III, and the RLDS Church, who were claiming that Joseph kind of denied polygamy at the end of his life.
That's right, yeah.
What's another one here? So I have no doubt that Brother Joseph thought his works up to the time of his repentance just before his death were acceptable unto God. Poor Joseph. He was blinded and became ensnared by proud, ambitious men. I labored hard with him to get him to see it from 1835, and God alone knows the grief and sorrow I have had over it. I have been told that Joseph repented just before he died. He is in the hands of a just God. This sort of arrogant, condescending view that somehow he somehow was trying to help poor, deluded Joseph Smith, when the reverse is true. Joseph Smith and the other members of the church were trying to help David Whitmer to see the error of his ways. And instead of accepting it, his pride got in the way. He left the church and ironically lives the longest of any of the three witnesses. And yet, at the end of his life, what is he spending the last days of his life doing as the last living witness of the Book of Mormon? He's trashing Joseph Smith. He's trashing the Doctrine and Covenants. He's trashing the priesthoods, the doctrines restored to the church, and basically claiming that the whole church is in error. And if only we could all see the truth and follow his ways, we might be saved if God would condescend enough to do that for us. We definitely had several of the 8 witnesses who went with David Whitmer, Hiram Page being one. And then you had 2 of the Whitmers who died before the Whitmer family kind of apostatized. And then you had the Smiths. You had Joseph Smith Sr., Samuel Smith, and Hiram Smith, who stayed faithful to Joseph. Here's the question was it enough witnesses? If we're doing a courtroom trial and we had 8 witnesses and 3 of them are not reliable, and we had 5 more, would it be enough? Would we be glad that we had 8 instead of just 2? I think so. And of your 3 witnesses, we don't have statements from Oliver Cowdery like we have from David Whitmer. Oliver Cowdery was consistent in his description of how the translation of the Book of Mormon happened, always references the Urim and Thummim, and he says that he wrote basically almost every page of what we currently have as the Book of Mormon. Never mentions anything about a hat, never mentions anything about a single stone being used. And he does leave the church, but he doesn't go to the extent that David Whitmer does to basically deny all the revelations that happened after 1829. But he doesn't go to the extent that David Whitmer does, where you have to say, hey, you know what, Oliver Cowdery, we just can't believe anything you say because you left the church. He's kind of a good example of what people like to think was the case with David Whitmer, which was he was mad and left the church, but still believed everything. But that's not what happened with David Whitmer. He clearly does not believe most of the restoration doctrines.
Yeah. And again, it's a little fuzzy because he stays in the church for several years. And One of the concerns I have with statements by David Whitmer as well, and when someone leaves the church, oftentimes it's not done suddenly, it's done very gradually. And so, it makes me wonder what he was talking about when he was the stake president in Missouri to these saints, and he's already disenfranchised. And you and I, there's other statements that he's had that are earlier.
Once someone leaves, then we all have this challenge of going, well, how long earlier did they actually leave the church before they left the church? Which of these
Right.
statements can we actually have any credibility if they really had left the church in their hearts, but hadn't left the church on paper yet?
That's
And
right.
so this is part of why I think it's okay to say, you know what, we don't need David Whitmer. The restoration moved on without him. The Book of Mormon can continue and be just as true. Even if David Whitmer is a witness, we just need to discard as being uncredible. And I think, unfortunately, we have to do that because when you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up both ends.